You ever find yourself wondering about the daily lives of people way back in history? Sometimes the most revealing stuff comes from unexpected places, like, well, what they ate.
Absolutely. It's funny how food works like that.
Yeah. We actually had a listener ask something that sounded pretty simple. When Emperor Wu of Jin ate steamed piglets, was that considered, a bit weird for his time?
That's a fantastic question. It really is
Uh,
because it seems so specific, right? But it opens up this whole huge window into Chinese history.
Right.
The fact that we'd even ask that the idea that eating pork might have been unusual at some point, that tells such a fascinating story about, well, the long and complicated relationship between the Chinese people and the pig.
Okay.
It's a journey, really,
Yeah.
from ancient rituals all the way to what emperors were having for dinner.
Exactly. So today, that's what we're diving into. The history of pork in China. We're going to trace its story, the ups and downs, when it was popular, when maybe not so much, starting way back in the Neolithic period, right up to the Qing Dynasty. And like you said, it's not just about the food itself.
No, not at all. It's about understanding how societies change, what they value, even how geography shapes culture.
Okay, so let's tackle that first question head on. Emperor Wu of Jin, enjoying his steamed piglets. Was he doing something unusual?
No, not in the slightest. For his time, Emperor Wu eating piglets. That was pretty standard stuff.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, the sources are quite clear. Pigs have been a really significant meat source in China for a very, very long time. We've got evidence stretching way back into Neolithic times.
Wow, Neolithic. We're talking really ancient history.
We are. So the pig wasn't just, dinner. It was fundamental to early Chinese settled life. A symbol of prosperity even, because it was just so practical.
Okay, practical. But what kind of clues do we actually have from that far back, like Neolithic clues?
Well, archaeologists find pig mandibles, the lower jawbones in burial sites.
Mhm.
And it's not just random trash. The fact they're placed deliberately suggests they had symbolic weight. It hints that owning pigs, well, that was a sign of wealth in those very early societies.
That's amazing. So right from the get-go, pigs had this status. It really makes you think how deep this runs in the culture.
It does. And that brings us to something really fundamental. It's your Chinese character for home, which is Ji.
Ah, right. I've heard about this.
If you look at it,
Mhm.
under the roof part, you've got the character Chi, and on its own just means pig.
So literally, pig under a roof is home.
Exactly. The very concept of home in the writing system is tied to having a pig. It just underlines how central they were to early settled life.
That is such a powerful image. Okay, so clearly pigs were important early on. But why pigs? Why not say mostly cows or sheep like we see in other parts of the world? What made pigs the go-to choice?
That's a really good question, and the answer boils down to some key differences in how you raise these animals, especially for early farming societies in China. Think about it. Cows and sheep, they're pretty migratory.
Right.
You can herd them over long distances. Pigs, well, they can move, but it's much harder to manage big herds that way.
Right, less mobile.
And then there's diet. Cows and sheep are grazers. They need grass. Pigs, they're omnivores. They'll eat, well, almost anything.
So they're less picky eaters, easier
Yes.
to feed, maybe.
Precisely.
Huh.
And another point, cows and sheep give you milk, another valuable resource. Pigs don't.
Ah, okay.
But maybe the biggest factor, especially when you've got farming communities and growing populations, is land use.
How so?
Raising cows and sheep takes a lot of pasture land. Land you could be using to grow crops.
Right, direct competition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Pigs, though, they don't need big grazing areas. You can keep them in smaller spaces, feed them scraps. They don't compete with your main food production, the agriculture.
That makes total sense. If you're trying to squeeze the most food out of your land, pigs seem way more efficient.
Absolutely. And that's why, in areas like the northern grasslands where farming was tough, you see cattle and sheep dominating.
Because the land was good for grazing.
Right. Their whole nomadic lifestyle revolved around herding. Pigs just didn't fit that model nearly as well.
Mm.
So from the very start, geography and farming dictated which animals became most important where.
Okay, so the early dominance of pigs in agricultural China seems pretty clear. Now let's shift gears a bit. What about the Pre-Qin period, leading up into the Han Dynasty? How did pork fit in then?
Right. So during this long stretch, the Central Plains are still mainly agricultural, but population density wasn't quite as intense as it would get later on.
Okay.
So there was still some land available for grazing, and the idea of the six domestic animals was already well established.
That's horses, cattle, sheep, chickens, dogs, and pigs, right?
Exactly. Now, horses generally weren't for eating, more for transport and warfare.
Oh.
But the other five, common meat sources.
And like we touched on, cows and sheep maybe had a bit more of a fancy reputation in those farming areas.
That's right. Because they were less common, needed more land, beef and mutton definitely had a bit more prestige. But, and this is important, pork wasn't seen as low-grade food at all. Not by a long shot. It was eaten widely across different social classes.
So maybe not the absolute top tier, but a solid, respectable staple for lots of people.
Precisely. We see proof of this in different historical texts. Think about the Zhou dynasty rituals.
Okay.
Pork was included in the meals for the Son of Heaven, the Emperor, served in several of those 9 special ritual tripods. That's pretty high status.
Definitely.
And even lower-ranking nobles, the scholar class, for example, eating pork was kind of a sign that they were meat eaters, that they had a certain status. It showed a level of prosperity.
Ah, so if pork was on your table, it meant you were doing okay, you had some means.
You got it. And there's some great little stories that illustrate this, too. You remember the one from the Analects about Yang Hu trying to give Confucius a suckling pig?
Oh, right. Yeah, he left it at his door, trying to force Confucius to come thank him, basically, using a piglet as social leverage.
Exactly. It shows a suckling pig wasn't just some trivial thing. It was a valuable gift, something you could use strategically.
Yeah, definitely not cheap.
And then there's that really dramatic scene, at the feast at Hongmen. It's in Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian.
Mm-hmm.
Shang Yu throws a raw pig's shoulder to Feng Kuai.
A raw pig's shoulder, that sounds intense.
It was meant as sort of a rough but definitely substantial reward for Feng Kuai's boldness. Again, it shows pork, even like that, was a recognized significant food item.
Okay.
So all through the pre-Qin to Han period, pork is common, it's accepted, it's part of the diet across the board. Which brings us back to Emperor Wu living right in that period. Eating piglets was perfectly normal.
Got it. So totally normal for his time. But that original question, I suspect, was maybe hinting at a later shift, right? Especially with the mention of sushi later on. When did things start to change for pork?
Yes. The turning point, or at least the beginning of one, seems to be during the Wei, Jin, and Southern and Northern dynasties.
Okay, the period after the Han falls apart, more chaotic times.
Exactly. It's a more turbulent era, the one often described in texts like a new account of tales of the world. Several things are going on. One big one is climate. It actually got colder.
Colder. How did that affect things?
Well, it pushed nomadic peoples from the north further south into traditionally agricultural areas.
And these nomadic groups brought different food habits with them, right? More focused on herding.
Precisely. Their diets were heavy on beef and especially mutton, animals suited to their pastoral lifestyle.
Okay.
Then you add in the chaos of the times, constant warfare, social upheaval. Population actually dropped quite a bit in some areas, and a lot of farmland was just abandoned, which ironically meant more land became available for grazing.
Ah, so the conditions kind of shifted to favor sheep and cattle raising, even in formerly agricultural zones.
In a way, yes. All these factors combined meant mutton became much more available, and its popularity really shot up.
More sheep around, more mutton gets eaten. Makes sense.
It does.
Yeah.
And there's a really interesting anecdote about Sima Rui. He was the first emperor of the Eastern Jin after the move south.
Okay.
When he got to Nanjing, things were really unstable, people were poor, pigs were actually scarce. And the meat from the back of the pig's neck apparently was considered super delicious and rare.
Just that one cut.
Yeah. They got the special name Jin Luan. Jin meaning something like restricted or exclusive, and Luan is this mythical bird linked to the emperor. So imperial exclusive meat.
Wow.
It was seen as so special that ordinary folks felt they weren't worthy of eating it and should offer it up to the emperor instead.
Imperial exclusive meat from a pig's neck. That really shows how scarcity can just skyrocket the perceived value of something.
It absolutely does. And this whole Jin Luan story even became a kind of common saying mentioned in a new account of Tales of the World. People used it as a warning, like, hands off, that's already claimed by someone powerful, like the emperor's intended son-in-law in the original story.
Fascinating. So during this whole Jin period, pork maybe isn't looked down on yet, but its status is definitely getting complicated compared to earlier times. Mutton's on the rise.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so what about the Tang Dynasty that followed? Did mutton keep its top spot?
Oh, definitely. The Tang Dynasty saw mutton continue to be very popular. Our sources even give us some interesting numbers from a text called The Extensive Records of the Taiping Era.
Oh, yeah. What do they say?
Well, looking at mentions of Tang people eating meat, Mutton comes up 47 times. Pork, only 12 times.
Wow, 47 versus 12. That's a pretty clear preference showing through. Mutton was definitely the trendy meat.
It strongly suggests that yes, but, and this is important, it doesn't mean pork vanished. Not at all.
Okay.
It was still a significant food, particularly for the higher levels of society.
Mm.
We have records showing that princes and top-ranking officials, like second rank, got a monthly allowance from the court.
An allowance of food.
Yeah, and it included 20 sheep and 60 jin of pork. A jin is a unit of weight, about half a kilogram.
So a decent amount of pork for the top brass.
Right, but interestingly, lower-ranking officials, say third to fifth rank, they only got mutton, no pork allocation for them.
Huh. So while mutton was maybe the everyday favorite, getting pork was almost like a perk for the real elites, like a status symbol in its own way.
It seems that way. It suggests that even if mutton was more widely preferred, pork still held a certain value and was definitely not seen as undesirable, especially by those at the top.
Okay, interesting dynamic. Now let's push forward to the Northern Song Dynasty. This is Sushi's time, right? And this is supposedly when pork status really took a nosedive.
That's the period our sources point to, yes. The Northern Song seems to be where pork's prestige really declined significantly.
Oh, yeah.
Now, again, it's crucial to remember, people were still eating tons of pork. There's a source, the record of the Eastern capital. A dream of splendor.
Right, describing the capital city beyond Qing.
Exactly. It paints this picture of a super busy pig trade. Tens of thousands of pigs supposedly coming into the city every single day.
Tens of thousands a day. So it wasn't scarce at all. People were definitely still eating it in huge quantities.
Absolutely. Sheer volume-wise, it was a major food source.
So if it was so common, why did its social standing dip? What was the problem?
The main driver seems to have been the imperial family themselves. They just didn't really care for pork.
The emperors didn't like it.
Apparently not. The statistics from Emperor Shenzong's reign are pretty stark. The imperial kitchens went through something like hundreds of thousands of jin of mutton annually.
Okay. And pork?
Only maybe 4,000 or 5,000 jin, a tiny fraction in comparison.
Whoa. That is a massive difference. Hundreds of thousands versus a few thousand. So the palace just wasn't serving much pork.
Exactly. And you know how these things work. What the emperor and the court prefer, well, that tends to trickle down.
Right. Sets the fashion. Even for food.
If the top dogs aren't eating pork, then the nobility, the wealthy merchants, they start to see it as less refined, maybe even a bit common.
So it got tagged as being less sophisticated, less high class.
Precisely. And that's the context for Su Dongpo's famous poem, The Ode to Pork.
Ah, okay. Remind us what he said.
He wrote something like, "The pork in Huangzhou is good, but its price is as cheap as dirt. The noble ones are unwilling to eat it, and the poor ones don't know how to cook it."
Cheap as dirt. Nobles won't eat it, poor don't know how. That really paints a picture, doesn't it?
It perfectly captures that social moment. Pork was abundant, it was inexpensive, but because of that, the upper crust kind of turned their noses up at it. And maybe the poorer folks lacked the fancy cooking methods to make it seem appealing.
So Sushi wasn't saying nobody ate pork, but that it had become this kind of look down upon food, especially among the wealthy.
Exactly. His poem is like a little snapshot of that specific social attitude in the Northern Song.
Okay, so that's the low point, maybe. What happened after the Song Dynasty? Did pork just stay in the culinary doghouse?
Not exactly. Things shifted again with the Southern Song Dynasty. The geography was different down south.
Warmer, wetter, less land suitable for grazing, right?
Right. And that made raising sheep much harder. Mutton became scarce and expensive, even for high officials. There's a story about Emperor Gozong. When he was fleeing south, his court could only manage to slaughter one sheep per day.
Only one sheep for the whole court. That really shows how rare it must have been.
It does. So with mutton hard to get, that created an opening for pork to make a comeback.
Ah, necessity steps in if you can't get mutton easily.
Exactly. And then as China's population kept growing over the following centuries, the pressure to use every bit of land for crops just intensified.
Less and less room for grazing animals like sheep or cattle.
Right. But pigs, remember, they don't need much pasture. They fit much better into that intensive agricultural system. So they became the more practical, efficient choice for meat. By the time you get to the Ming Dynasty, pork's popularity had definitely overtaken mutton again.
And isn't that funny story about the Ming Emperor Zhengde? He wanted to ban killing pigs because his own surname, Zhu, sounded like the word for pig.
Huh? Yes, that's the one. But he apparently dropped the idea pretty quickly when he realized just how essential pork was to people's diets. There wasn't really a substitute they could switch to easily.
Shows how important it had become again.
It does. But the real boost, the thing that really elevated pork's status again, came with the Qing Dynasty.
The Manchus, how did they change things?
Well, the Manchus, before they conquered China, had this sort of mixed lifestyle, part farming, part pastoral. And raising pigs was a really important tradition for them.
Okay.
They also used pigs heavily in their religious rituals and sacrifices. So when they established the Qing Dynasty, they brought these customs with them, right into the heart of the empire.
So Manchu traditions favored pigs.
Very much so. Famously, in the Forbidden City, in the Cunning Palace, which was originally the Empress's residence, they had this daily ritual.
What did they do?
They slaughtered 2 pigs every single morning and evening for sacrifices. And then the pork from these sacrifices was distributed and eaten communally right there in the palace.
Wow, daily ritual pork feasts in the palace.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And having the imperial family themselves consuming pork in this very formal, ritualistic way, that gave pork a huge boost in prestige.
What a turnaround. From being snubbed by song nobles to being part of Qing imperial ritual.
It really is quite the reversal. There's even this Qing Dynasty observation that's pretty telling. Someone noted that people used to think pork was unhealthy, but now everyone eats it, and look, they're strong, they have lots of kids, they're healthy.
Huh.
The saying went something like, pork enriches internally and makes one plump externally, and the descendants multiply. High praise.
That's why it sounds like it.
And then you have Yuan Mei, the famous food writer, in his book, The Way of Eating. He actually compares pork to the supreme leader among ingredients because it was used in so many dishes.
The supreme leader of food. That's about as high as you can get. So from Neolithic burial gifts all the way to supreme leader status. Quite a journey for the humble pig.
It absolutely is. And it just hammers home that point, doesn't it? The story of one type of food, its rise and fall and rise again, it mirrors these huge shifts in the environment. Farming, social structures, cultural tastes.
It really makes you rethink that listener's question. What sounded so simple, was it weird for an emperor to eat piglets, actually unlocked this whole massive, complex history.
Exactly. And, connecting this to that slightly broader point about meat consumption, why did people in medieval Europe maybe eat more meat overall than in China, even when China's economy might have been quite advanced?
Right. The sources mention land use as a key factor there, too.
Precisely. Europe generally had lower population density, more land available that was suitable for pasture, not necessarily prime cropland.
So raising lots of cattle and sheep was just more feasible on a large scale.
It seems so. The sources even gave those figures for cultivated land area in 2022, showing Europe having significantly more than China relative to total area, perhaps. It hints at these very long-term differences in how land tends to be used. Traditional Chinese agriculture, for millennia, has really focused on maximizing crop yield from the available land, so feeding more people directly from plants.
So a simple dietary difference really comes down to fundamental geography and population density. It is all connected.
It really is, and that's honestly what makes food history so compelling. It's never just about what's on the plate, is it?
Not at all. So bringing it back to you, our listener, we really hope this deep dive into pork in China has maybe given you that kind of aha moment, that understanding of how deeply tangled food history is with these huge historical forces. That simple question about Emperor Wu's piglets really opened up centuries of change, social, economic, environmental.
And maybe it leaves us with a final thought to chew on, so to speak. How might people in the future look back at our current food trends? What we eat now, what we avoid.
Oh, interesting.
What big societal shifts might our diets reflect? Think about why you choose the foods you do. What are the bigger stories behind those choices? It's a really fascinating way to look at our own time, isn't it?